Chapter 1 of Peter Simple. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Sylvia M.B. in Washington State. Peter Simple by Frederick Marryat. Chapter 1. The great advantage of being the fool of the family. My destiny is decided, and I am consigned to a stockbroker as part of His Majesty's sea stock. Unfortunately for me, Mr. Handicock is a bear, and I get very little dinner. If I cannot narrate a life of adventurous and daring exploits, fortunately I have no heavy crimes to confess, and if I do not rise in the estimation of the reader for acts of gallantry and devotion in my country's cause, at least I may claim the merit of zealous and persevering continuance in my vocation. We are all of us variously gifted from above, and he who is content to walk instead of to run on his allotted path through life, although he may not so rapidly attain the goal, has the advantage of not being out of breath upon his arrival. As well as I can recollect and analyse my early propensities, I think that, had I been permitted to select my own profession, I should in all probability have bound myself apprentice to a tailor, for I always envied the comfortable seat which they appeared to enjoy upon the shop board, and their elevated position, which enabled them to look down upon the constant succession of the idle or the busy, who passed in review before them in the main street of the country town, near to which I passed the first 14 years of my existence. But my father, who was a clergyman of the Church of England, and the youngest brother of a noble family, had a lucrative living, and a soul above buttons if his son had not. It has been from time immemorial the heathenish custom to sacrifice the greatest fool of the family to the prosperity and naval superiority of the country, and at the age of 14 I was selected as the victim. If the custom be judicious, I had no reason to complain. There was not one dissentient voice when it was proposed before all the varieties of my aunts and cousins, invited to partake of our New Year's festival. I was selected by general acclamation. Flattered by such a unanimous acknowledgment of my qualification, I felt a slight degree of military ardour, and a sort of vision of future grandeur passed before me, in the distant vista of which I perceived a coach with 4 horses and a service of plate. But as my story is not a very short one, I must not dwell too long on its commencement. I shall therefore inform the reader that my father, who lived in the north of England, did not think it right to fit me out at the country town near to which we resided, but about a fortnight after the decision which I have referred to, he forwarded me to London on the outside of the coach, with my best suit of bottle green and 6 shirts. To prevent mistakes, I was booked in the waybill to be delivered to Mr. Thomas Handicock, number 14, St. Clement's Lane, carriage paid. My parting with the family was very affecting. My mother cried bitterly, for like all mothers she liked the greatest fool which she had presented to my father, better than all the rest. My sisters cried because my mother cried. Tom roared for a short time more loudly than all the rest, having been chastised by my father for breaking his 4th window in that week. At last I tore myself away. I had blubbered till my eyes were so red and swollen that the pupils were scarcely to be distinguished, and tears and dirt had veined my cheeks like the marble of the chimney piece. My handkerchief was soaked through with wiping my eyes and blowing my nose before the scene was over. My brother Tom, with a kindness which did honour to his heart, exchanged his for mine, saying with fraternal regard, "Here, Peter, take mine, it's as dry as a bone." But my father would not wait for a second handkerchief to perform its duty. He led me away through the hall, when, having shaken hands with all the men, I kissed all the maids, who stood in a row with their aprons to their eyes. I quitted the paternal roof. The coachman accompanied me to the stage. Having seen me securely wedged between 2 fat old women, and having put my parcel inside, he took his leave, and in a few minutes I was on my road to London. I was too much depressed to take notice of anything during my journey. When we arrived in London, they drove to the Blue Boar, in a street the name of which I have forgotten. I had never seen nor heard of such an animal, and certainly it did appear very formidable. Its mouth was open and teeth very large. The coachman threw his whip to the ostler, and the reins upon the horse's back. He then dismounted, and calling to me, "Now, young gentleman, I'se waiting," he put a ladder up for me to get down by. Then turning to a porter, he said to him, "Bill, you must take this here young gentleman and that ere parcel to this here direction. Please to remember the coachman, sir." I replied that I certainly would if he wished it, and walked off with the porter. The coachman observing as I went away, "Well, he is a fool, that's sartain." I arrived quite safe at St. Clement's Lane, when the porter received a shilling for his trouble from the maid who let me in, and I was shown up into a parlour, where I found myself in company with Mrs. Handicock. Mrs. Handicock was a little meagre woman, who did not speak very good English, and who appeared to me to employ the major part of her time in bawling out from the top of the stairs to the servants below. I never saw her either read a book or occupy herself with needlework during the whole time I was in the house. She had a large grey parrot, and I really cannot tell which screamed the worst of the two, but she was very civil and kind to me. Before I had been there 10 minutes, she told me that she "adored sailors. They were the defendiors and preserviors of their kings and countries," and that Mr. Handicock would be home by 4 o'clock, and then we should go to dinner. As I was very anxious to see Mr. Handicock, and very anxious to have my dinner, I was not sorry to hear the clock on the stairs strike 4, when Mrs. Handicock jumped up, and put her head over the banisters. "Jemima, Jemima, it's 4 o'clock." "I hear it, marm," replied the cook, and she gave the frying pan a twist, which made the hissing and the smell come flying up into the parlour, and made me more hungry than ever. "Rat tap tap, there's your master, Jemima," screamed the lady. "I hear him, marm," replied the cook. "Run down, my dear, and let Mr. Handicock in," said his wife. "He'll be so surprised at seeing you open the door." I ran down, as Mrs. Handicock desired me, and opened the street door. "Who the devil are you?" in a gruff voice cried Mr. Handicock, a man about 6 feet high, dressed in blue cotton net pantaloons and Hessian boots, with a black coat and waistcoat. I was a little rebuffed, I must own, but I replied that I was Mr. Simple. "And pray, Mr. Simple, what would your grandfather say if he saw you now?" "Law, Mr. Handicock," said his wife from the top of the stairs, "how can you be so cross? I told him to open the door to surprise you." "And you have surprised me," replied he, "with your cursed folly." While Mr. Handicock was rubbing his boots on the mat, I went upstairs, rather mortified, I must own, as my father had told me that Mr. Handicock was his stockbroker, and would do all he could to make me comfortable. When I returned to the parlour, Mrs. Handicock whispered to me, "Never mind, dear, it's only because there's something wrong on 'Change. Mr. Handicock is a bear just now." I thought so too, but made no answer, for Mr. Handicock came upstairs. "Are you ready for dinner, my dear?" said the lady, almost trembling. "If the dinner is ready for me, I believe we usually dine at 4, answered her husband gruffly. "Jemima, Jemima, dish up, do you hear, Jemima?" "Yes, marm," replied the cook, "directly I've thickened the butter." And Mrs. Handicock resumed her seat with, "Well, Mr. Simple, and how is your grandfather, Lord Privilege?" "He is quite well, ma'am," answered I, for the 15th time at least. But dinner put an end to the silence which followed this remark. Mr. Handicock walked downstairs, leaving his wife and me to follow at our leisure. "Pray, ma'am," inquired I, as soon as he was out of hearing, "what is the matter with Mr. Handicock, that he is so cross to you?" "Why, my dear, it is one of the misfortunes of matrimony, that when the husband put out, the wife is sure to have her share of it." "Are you people coming down to dinner?" roared Mr. Handicock from below. "Yes, my dear," replied the lady. "I thought that you were washing your hands." We descended to the dining room, where we found that Mr. Handicock had already devoured 2 of the whitings, leaving only 1 on the dish for his wife and me. "Would you like a little bit of whiting, my dear?" said the lady to me. "It's not worth having," observed the gentleman in a surly tone, taking up the fish with his own knife and fork, and putting it on his plate. "Well, I'm so glad you like them, my dear," replied the lady meekly. Then turning to me, "There's some nice roast veal coming, my dear." The veal made its appearance, and fortunately for us, Mr. Handicock could not devour it all. He took the lion's share, nevertheless, cutting off all the brown, and then shoving the dish over to his wife to help herself and me. After dinner, Mr. Handicock went down to the cellar for a bottle of wine. "Oh, dearie me!" exclaimed his wife, "he must have lost a mint of money. We had better go upstairs and leave him alone. He'll be better after a bottle of port, perhaps." I was very glad to go away, and being very tired, I went to bed without any tea, for Mrs. Handicock dared not venture to make it before her husband came upstairs. End of chapter 1. Chapter 2 of Peter Simple. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Sylvia M.B. in Washington State. Peter Simple by Frederick Marryat. Chapter 2. Fitting out on the shortest notice. Fortunately for me, this day Mr. Handicock is not a bear, and I fare very well. I set off for Portsmouth. Behind the coach I meet a man before the mast. He is disguised with liquor, but is not the only disguise I fall in with in my journey. The next morning Mr. Handicock appeared to be in somewhat better humour. One of the linen drapers, who fitted out cadets, etc., on the shortest notice, was sent for, and orders given for my equipment, which Mr. Handicock insisted should be ready on the day afterwards, or the articles would be left on his hands, adding that my place was already taken in the Portsmouth coach. The man made his promise, took my measure, and departed, and soon afterwards Mr. Handicock also quitted the house. At 4 o'clock Mr. Handicock rapped at the door, and was let in, but not by me. He ascended the stairs with 3 bounds, and coming into the parlour, cried, "Well, Nancy, my love, how are you?" Then stooping over her, "Give me a kiss, old girl. I'm as hungry as a hunter. Mr. Simple, how do you do? I hope you have passed the morning agreeably. I must wash my hands and change my boots, my love. I am not fit to sit down to table with you in this pickle. Well, Polly, how are you?" "I'm glad you're hungry, my dear. I've such a nice dinner for you," replied the wife, all smiles. "Jemima, be quick and dish up. Mr. Handicock is so hungry." "Yes, marm," replied the cook, and Mrs. Handicock followed her husband into his bedroom on the same floor, to assist him at his toilet. "By Jove, Nancy, the bulls have been nicely taken in," said Mr. Handicock, as we sat down to dinner. "Oh, I am so glad," replied his wife, giggling, and so I believe she was, but why I did not understand. We both had our share to day, and I never saw a man more polite than Mr. Handicock. He joked with his wife, asked me to drink wine with him 2 or 3 times, talked about my grandfather, and in short we had a very pleasant evening. The next morning all my clothes came home, but Mr. Handicock, who still continued in good humour, said that he would not allow me to travel by night, that I should sleep there and set off the next morning, which I did at 6 o'clock, and before 8 I had arrived at the Elephant and Castle, where we stopped for a quarter of an hour. I observed a crowd assembled at the corner, and asking a gentleman who sat by me in a plaid cloak, whether there was not something very uncommon to attract so many people, he replied, "Not very, for it is only a drunken sailor." I rose from my seat, which was on the hinder part of the coach, that I might see him, for it was a new sight to me, and excited my curiosity, when to my astonishment he staggered from the crowd, and swore that he'd go to Portsmouth. He climbed up by the wheel of the coach, and sat down by me. I believe that I stared at him very much, for he said to me, "What are you gaping at, you young sculpin? Do you want to catch flies, or did you never see a chap half seas over before?" I replied that I had never been at sea in my life, but that I was going. "Well, then you're like a bear, with all your sorrows to come." "That's all, my hearty," replied he. "When you get on board, you'll find monkey's allowance, more kicks than halfpence. I say, you pewter carrier, bring us another pint of ale." The waiter of the inn, who was attending the coach, brought out the ale, half of which the sailor drank, and the other half threw into the waiter's face, telling him, that was his allowance. "And now," said he, "what's to pay?" The waiter, who looked very angry, but appeared too much afraid of the sailor to say anything, answered 4d., and the sailor pulled out a handful of bank notes, mixed up with gold, silver, and coppers, and was picking out the money to pay for his beer, when the coachman, who was impatient, drove off. "There's cut and run," cried the sailor, thrusting all the money into his breeches pocket. "That's what you'll learn to do, my joker, before you have been 2 cruises to sea." In the meantime, the gentleman in the plaid cloak, who was seated by me, smoked his cigar without saying a word. I commenced a conversation with him relative to my profession, and asked him whether it was not very difficult to learn. "Larn!" cried the sailor, interrupting us. "No, it may be difficult for such chaps as me before the mast to larn, but you, I presume, is a reefer, and they ain't got much to larn, 'cause why? They pipe clays their weekly accounts, and walks up and down with their hands in their pockets. You must larn to chaw 'baccy, drink grog, and call the cat a beggar, and then you knows all a midshipman's expected to know nowadays. Aren't I right, sir?" said the sailor, appealing to the gentleman in a plaid cloak. "I axes you because I see you're a sailor by the cut of your jib. Beg pardon, sir," continued he, touching his hat. "Hope no offence. I am afraid that you have nearly hit the mark, my good fellow. replied the gentleman. Whenever the coach stopped, the sailor called for more ale, and always threw the remainder which he could not drink into the face of the man who brought it out for him, just as the coach was starting off, and then tossed the pewter pot on the ground for him to pick up. He became more tipsy every stage, and the last from Portsmouth, when he pulled out his money he could find no silver, so he handed down a note and desired the waiter to change it. The waiter crumpled it up and put it into his pocket, and then returned the sailor the change for a £1 note. But the gentleman in the plaid had observed that it was a £5 note which the sailor had given, and insisted upon the waiter producing it, and giving the proper change. The sailor took his money, which the waiter handed to him, begging pardon for the mistake, although he coloured up very much at being detected. "I really beg your pardon," said he again, "it was quite a mistake." Whereupon the sailor threw the pewter pot at the waiter, saying, "I really beg your pardon too," and with such force that it flattened upon the man's head, who fell senseless on the road. The coachman drove off, and I never heard whether the man was killed or not. I inquired of the gentleman how soon we should be at Portsmouth. He answered that we were passing the lines, but I saw no lines, and I was ashamed to show my ignorance. He asked me what ship I was going to join. I could not recollect her name, but I told him it was painted on the outside of my chest, which was coming down by the waggon. All that I could recollect was that it was a French name. "Have you no letter of introduction to the captain?" said he. "Yes, I have," replied I, and I pulled out my pocket book, in which the letter was "Captain Savage, HMS Diomede," continued I, reading to him. To my surprise, he very coolly proceeded to open the letter, which, when I perceived what he was doing, occasioned me immediately to snatch the letter from him, stating my opinion at the same time that it was a breach of honour, and that in my opinion he was no gentleman. "Just as you please, youngster," replied he. "Recollect you have told me I am no gentleman." He wrapped his plaid around him, and said no more. I was not a little pleased at having silenced him by my resolute behaviour. Chapter 2. Chapter 3 of Peter Simple. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Sylvia M.P. in Washington State. Peter Simple by Frederick Marryat. Chapter 3. I am made to look very blue at the Blue Posts, find wild spirits around, and soon after hot spirits within me. At length my spirits overcome me, called to pay my respects to the captain, and find that I had had the pleasure of meeting him before, no sooner out of one scrape than into another. When we stopped, I inquired of the coachman which was the best inn. He answered that it was the Blue Postesses, where the midshipmen leave their chestesses, call for tea and toastesses, and sometimes forget to pay for their breakfastesses. He laughed when he said it, and I thought that he was joking with me, but he pointed out 2 large blue posts at the door next the coach office, and told me that all the midshipmen resorted to that hotel. The coffee room was full of midshipmen, and, as I was anxious about my chest, I inquired of one of them if he knew when the waggon would come in. "Do you expect your mother by it?" replied he. "Oh no, but I expect my uniforms. I only wear these bottle greens until they come." "And pray what ship are you going to join?" "The Diomede, Captain Thomas Kirkwall Savage." "The Diomede, I say. Robinson, ain't that the frigate in which the midshipmen had 4 dozen apiece for not having pipe clayed their weekly accounts on the Saturday?" "To be sure it is," replied the other. "Why, the captain gave a youngster 5 dozen the other day for wearing a scarlet watch ribbon." "'Pon my soul, I pity you. You'll be fagged to death, for there's only 3 midshipmen in the ship now. All the rest ran away, didn't they, Robinson?" "There's only 2 left now, for poor Matthews died of fatigue. He was worked all day, and kept watch all night for 6 weeks, and one morning he was found dead upon his chest." "God bless my soul!" cried I. "And yet on shore they say he is such a kind man to his midshipmen." "Yes," replied Robinson, "he spreads that report everywhere. Come, sit down with us and take a glass of grog. It will keep your spirits up." I am sorry to state that the midshipmen made me very tipsy that evening. I don't recollect being put to bed, but I found myself there the next morning with a dreadful headache, and a very confused recollection of what had passed. I was very much shocked at my having so soon forgotten the injunctions of my parents, and was making vows never to be so foolish again, when in came the midshipman who had been so kind to me the night before. "Come, Mr Bottlegreen," he bawled out, alluding, I suppose, to the colour of my clothes, "rouse and bit. There's the captain's coxswain waiting for you below. By the powers, you're in a pretty scrape for what you did last night." "Did last night?" replied I, astonished. "Why, does the captain know that I was tipsy?" "I think you took devilish good care to let him know it when you were at the theatre." "At the theatre! Was I at the theatre?" "To be sure you were. You would go, do all we could to prevent you, though you were as drunk as David's sow. Your captain was there with the admiral's daughters. You called him a tyrant, and snapped your fingers at him. Why, don't you recollect? You told him that you did not care a fig for him." "Oh dear, oh dear, what shall I do? What shall I do?" cried I. "Upon my honour, I'm sorry, very sorry indeed," replied the midshipman, and he quitted the room, looking as grave as if the misfortune had happened to himself. I got up with a heavy head and heavier heart, and as soon as I was dressed, I asked the way to the George Inn. I took my letter of introduction with me, although I was afraid it would be of little service. When I arrived, I asked with a trembling voice whether Captain Thomas Kirkwall Savage, of the HMS Diomede, was staying there. The waiter replied that he was at breakfast with Captain Courtney, but that he would take up my name. I gave it him, and in a minute the waiter returned and desired that I would walk up. Oh, how my heart beat! I was never so frightened. I thought I should have dropped on the stairs. Twice I attempted to walk into the room, and each time my legs failed me. At last I wiped the perspiration from my forehead, and with a desperate effort I went into the room. "Mr Simple, I am glad to see you," said a voice. I had held my head down, for I was afraid to look at him, but the voice was so kind that I mustered up courage, and when I did look up, there sat with his uniform and epaulets, and his sword by his side, the passenger in the plaid cloak, who wanted to open my letter, and whom I had told to his face that he was no gentleman. I thought I should have died, as the other midshipman did upon his chest. I was just sinking down upon my knees to beg for mercy, when the captain, perceiving my confusion, burst out into a laugh, and said, "So you know me again, Mr Simple? Well, don't be alarmed. You did your duty in not permitting me to open the letter. I give you credit for your conduct. Now sit down and take some breakfast. Captain Courtney," said he to the other captain who was at the table, "this is one of my youngsters just entering the service. We were passengers yesterday by the same coach." He then told him the circumstance which occurred, at which they laughed heartily. I now recovered my spirits a little, but still there was the affair at the theatre, and I thought that perhaps he did not recognise me. I was, however, soon relieved from my anxiety by the other captain inquiring, "Were you at the theatre last night, Savage?" "No, I dined at the admiral's. There's no getting away from those girls. They are so pleasant." "I rather think you are a little taken in that quarter." "No, on my word, I might be if I had time to discover which I liked best, but my ship is at present my wife, and the only wife I intend to have until I am laid on the shelf." Well, thought I, if he was not at the theatre, it could not have been him that I insulted. "Pray, Mr Simple, how are your father and mother?" said the captain. "Very well, I thank you, sir, and desire me to present their compliments." "I am obliged to them. Now I have a little advice to offer you. In the first place, obey your superior officers without hesitation. It is for me, not you, to decide whether an order is unjust or not. In the next place, never swear or drink spirits. The first is immoral and ungentlemanlike. The second is a vile habit which will grow upon you. I never touch spirit myself, and I expect that my young gentleman will refrain from it also. Now you may go, and as soon as your uniforms arrive, you will repair on board. Good morning." I quitted the room with a low bow, glad to have surmounted so easily what appeared to be a chaos of difficulty, but my mind was confused with the testimony of the midshipman, so much at variance with the language and behaviour of the captain. When I arrived at the Blue Posts, I found all the midshipmen in the coffee room, and I repeated to them all that had passed. When I had finished, they burst out laughing, and said that they had only been joking with me. "Well," said I to the one who had called me up in the morning, "you may call it joking, but I call it lying." "Pray, Mr Bottlegreen, do you refer to me?" "Yes, I do," replied I. "Then, sir, as a gentleman, I demand satisfaction. Slugs in a saw pit. Death before dishonour, damn me." "Could not the affair be arranged otherwise?" interrupted another. "Will not Mr Bottlegreen retract?" "My name is Simple, sir, and not Bottlegreen," replied I, and as he did tell a falsehood, I will not retract." "Then the affair must go on," said the midshipman. "Robinson, will you oblige me by acting as my second?" "It's an unpleasant business," replied the other. "You are so good a shot; but as you requested, I shall not refuse. Mr Simple is not, I believe, provided with a friend." "Yes, he is," replied another of the midshipmen. "He is a spunky fellow, and I'll be his second." It was then arranged that we should meet the next morning with pistols. I considered that, as an officer and a gentleman, I could not well refuse, but I was very unhappy. I went up into my room and wrote a long letter to my mother, enclosing a lock of my hair, and having shed a few tears at the idea of how sorry she would be if I were killed, I borrowed a Bible from the waiter, and read it during the remainder of the day. Chapter 4 of Peter Simple. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Sylvia M.B. in Washington State. Peter Simple by Frederick Marryat. Chapter 4. I am taught on a cold morning before breakfast how to stand fire, and thus prove my courage. After breakfast I also prove my gallantry. My proof meets reproof. Women at the bottom of all mischief. By one I lose my liberty, and by another my money. When I began to wake the next morning, I could not think what it was that felt like a weight upon my chest, but as I roused and recalled my scattered thoughts, I remembered that in an hour or two it would be decided whether I were to exist another day. Before I was dressed, the midshipman who had volunteered to be my second came into my room, and informed me that the affair was to be decided in the garden behind the inn, and that my adversary was a very good shot. I dressed myself and followed my second into the garden, where I found all the midshipmen and some of the waiters of the inn. They all seemed very merry, as if the life of a fellow creature was of no consequence. The seconds talked apart for a little while, and then measured the ground, which was 12 paces. We then took our stations. I believe that I turned pale, for my second came to my side and whispered that I must not be frightened. I replied that I was not frightened, but that I considered that it was an awful moment. The second to my adversary then came up and asked me whether I would make an apology, which I refused to do as before. They handed a pistol to each of us, and my second showed me how I was to pull the trigger. It was arranged that at the word given we were to fire at the same time. I made sure that I should be wounded if not killed, and I shut my eyes as I fired my pistol in the air. I felt my head swim and thought I was hurt, but fortunately I was not. The pistols were loaded again, and we fired a second time. The seconds then interfered, and it was proposed that we should shake hands, which I was very glad to do, for I considered my life to have been saved by a miracle. The next day my chest arrived by the wagon, and I threw off my bottle greens and put on my uniform. I had no cocked hat or dirk, as the warehouse people employed by Mr Handycock did not supply those articles, and it was arranged that I should procure them at Portsmouth. When I inquired the price, I found that they cost more money than I had in my pocket, so I tore up the letter I had written to my mother before the duel, and wrote another, asking for a remittance to purchase my dirk and cocked hat. I then walked out in my uniform, not a little proud, I must confess. I had arrived opposite a place called Sallyport, when a young lady, very nicely dressed, looked at me very hard, and said, "Well, Reefer, how are you off for soap?" I was astonished at the question, and more so at the interest which she seemed to take in my affairs. I answered, "Thank you, I am very well off. I have 4 cakes of Windsor and 2 bars of yellow for washing." She laughed at my reply, and asked me whether I would walk home and take a bit of dinner with her. I was astonished at this polite offer, and I said that I should be most happy. I thought I might venture to offer my arm, which she accepted, and we proceeded up High Street on our way to her home. Just as we passed the admiral's house, I perceived my captain walking with 2 of the admiral's daughters. I was not a little proud to let him see that I had female acquaintances as well as he had, and as I passed him with the young lady under my protection, I took off my hat and made him a low bow. To my surprise, not only did he not return the salute, but he looked at me with a very stern countenance. I concluded that he was a very proud man, and did not wish the admiral's daughters to suppose that he knew midshipmen by sight. But I had not exactly made up my mind on the subject, when the captain, having seen the ladies into the admiral's house, sent one of the messengers after me to desire that I would immediately come to him at the George Inn, which was nearly opposite. I apologised to the young lady, and promised to return immediately if she would wait for me, but she replied If that was my captain, it was her idea that I should have a confounded wigging and be sent on board. So, wishing me good bye, she left me and continued her way home. I could as little comprehend all this as why the captain looked so black when I passed him, but it was soon explained when I went up to him in the parlour at the George Inn. "I am sorry, Mr Simple," said the captain, when I entered, "that a lad like you should show such early symptoms of depravity, still more so that he should not have the grace which even the most hardened are not wholly destitute of. I mean to practise immorality in secret, and not degrade themselves and insult their captain by unblushingly avowing, and I may say glorying in, their iniquity, by exposing it in broad daylight and in the most frequented street of town." "Sir!" replied I, with astonishment. "Oh dear, what have I done?" The captain fixed his keen eyes upon me, so that they appeared to pierce me through, and nail me to the wall. "Do you pretend to say, sir, that you were not aware of the character of the person with whom you were walking just now?" "No, sir," replied I, "except that she was very kind and good natured." And then I told him how she had addressed me, and what subsequently took place. "And is it possible, Mr Simple, that you are so great a fool?" I replied that I certainly was considered the greatest fool of our family. "I should think you were," replied he, drily. He then explained to me who the person was with whom I was in company, and how any association with her would inevitably lead to my ruin and disgrace. I cried very much, for I was shocked at the narrow escape which I had had, and mortified at having fallen in his good opinion. He asked me how I had employed my time since I had been at Portsmouth, and I made an acknowledgment of having been made tipsy, related all that the midshipman had told me, and how I had that morning fought a duel. When I had finished, he said, "Mr Simple, I can no longer trust you on shore until you are more experienced in the world. I shall desire my coxswain not to lose sight of you until you are safe on board of the frigate." Altogether I did not feel sorry when it was over. I saw that the captain believed what I had stated, and that he was disposed to be kind to me, although he thought me very silly. The coxswain, in obedience to his orders, accompanied me to the Blue Post. I packed up my clothes, paid my bill, and the porter wheeled my chest down to the sally port, where the boat was waiting. "Come, heave ahead, my lads. Be smart. The captain says we are to take the young gentleman on board directly. His liberty stopped for getting drunk and running after the dollymops." "I should think you to be more respectful in your remarks, Mr Coxswain," said I, with displeasure. "Mr Coxswain! Thank ye, sir, for giving me a handle to my name," replied he. "Come, be smart with yours, my lads." "La, Bill Freeman," said a young woman on the beach, "what a nice young gentleman you have there. He looks like a sucking Nelson. I say, my pretty young officer, could you lend me a shilling?" I was so pleased at the woman calling me young Nelson, that I immediately complied with her request. "I have not a shilling in my pocket," said I, "but here is half a crown, and you can change it and bring me back the 18 pence." "Well, you are a nice young man," replied she, taking the half crown. "I'll be back directly, my dear." The men in the boat laughed, and the coxswain desired them to shove off. "No," observed I, "you must wait for my 18 pence." "We shall wait a devilish long while then, I suspect. I know that girl, and she has a very bad memory." "She cannot be so dishonest or ungrateful," replied I. "Coxswain, I order you to stay. I am an officer." "I know you are, sir, about 6 hours old. Well, then, I must go up and tell the captain that you have another girl in tow, and that you won't go on board." "Oh no, Mr Coxswain, pray don't. Shove off as soon as you please, and never mind the 18 pence." The boat then shoved off, and pulled towards the ship, which lay at Spithead. Chapter 5
of Peter Simple. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Devora Allen. Peter Simple by Frederick Marryat. Chapter 5. I am introduced to the quarterdeck and first lieutenant, who pronounces me very clever. Trotted below to Mrs Trotter. Connubial bliss in a cockpit. Mrs Trotter takes me in as a messmate. On our arrival on board, the coxswain gave a note from the captain to the first lieutenant, who happened to be on deck. He read the note, looked at me earnestly, and then I overheard him say to another lieutenant, "The service is going to the devil. Here's another of the fools of a family made a present of to the country. Another cub for me to lick into shape. Well, I never saw the one yet I did not make something of. Where's Mr. Simple?" "I am Mr. Simple, sir," replied I, very much frightened at what I had overheard. "Now, Mr. Simple," said the first lieutenant, "observe and pay particular attention to what I say. The captain tells me in this note that you have been shamming stupid. Now, sir, I am not to be taken in that way. I have looked attentively at your face, and I see at once that you are very clever, and if you do not prove so in a very short time, why, you had better jump overboard, that's all. Perfectly understand me. I know that you are a very clever fellow, and having told you so, don't you pretend to impose upon me, for it won't do." I was very much terrified at this speech, but at the same time I was pleased to hear that he thought me clever, and I determined to do all in my power to keep up such an unexpected reputation. "Quartermaster," said the first lieutenant, "tell Mr. Trotter to come on deck." The quartermaster brought up Mr. Trotter, who apologized for being so dirty, as he was breaking casks out of the hold. He was a short, thick-set man, about 30 years of age, with a nose which had a red club to it, very dirty teeth, and large black whiskers. "Mr. Trotter," said the first lieutenant, "here is a young gentleman who has joined the ship. Introduce him into the berth, and see his hammock slung. You must look after him a little." "I really have very little time to look after any of them, sir," replied Mr. Trotter, "but I will do what I can. Follow me, youngster." Accordingly, I descended the ladder after him. Then I went down another, and then to my surprise I was desired by him to go down a third, which, when I had done, he informed me that I was in the cockpit. "Now, youngster," said Mr. Trotter, seating himself upon a large chest, "you may do as you please. The midshipmen's mess is on the deck above this, and if you like to join, why, you can. But this I will tell you as a friend, that you will be thrashed all day long, and fare very badly. The weakest always goes to the wall there, but perhaps you do not mind that. Now that we are in harbour, I mess here, because Mrs. Trotter is on board. She is a very charming woman, I can assure you, and will be here directly. She has just gone up into the galley to look after a net of potatoes in the copper. If you like it better, I will ask her permission for you to mess with us." I had scarcely time to reply, when I perceived a pair of legs, cased in black cotton stockings, on the ladder above us, and it proved that they belonged to Mrs. Trotter, who came down the ladder with a net full of smoking potatoes. "Upon my word, Mrs. Trotter, you must be conscious of having a very pretty ankle, or you would not venture to display it, as you have to Mr. Simple, a young gentleman whom I beg to introduce to you, and who, with your permission, will join our mess." "My dear Trotter, how cruel of you not to give me warning! I thought that nobody was below. I declare I'm so ashamed," continued the lady, simpering, and covering her face with the hand which was unemployed. "It can't be helped now, my love. Neither was there anything to be ashamed of. I trust Mr. Simple and you will be very good friends. I believe I mentioned his desire to join our mess." "I am sure I shall be very happy in his company. This is a strange place for me to live in, Mr. Simple, after the society to which I have been accustomed, but affection can make any sacrifice, and rather than lose the company of my Trotter, who has been unfortunate in pecuniary matters—" "But, my dear," interrupted Mr. Trotter, "is it not time to look after our dinner?" "Yes, I am going forward for it now. We have skewer pieces to day, Mr. Simple. Will you excuse me?" And then, with a great deal of flirtation and laughing about her ankles, and requesting me, as a favour, to turn my face away, Mrs. Trotter ascended the ladder. As the reader may wish to know what sort of looking personage she was, I will take this opportunity to describe her. Her figure was very good, and at one period of her life I thought her face must have been very handsome. At the time I was introduced to her, it showed the ravages of time or hardship very distinctly. In short, she might be termed a faded beauty, flaunting in her dress, and not very clean in her person. "Charming woman, Mrs. Trotter, is she not, Mr. Simple?" said the master's mate, to which of course I immediately acquiesced. "Now, Mr. Simple," continued he, "there are a few arrangements which I had better mention while Mrs. Trotter is away, for she would be shocked at our talking about such things. Of course, the style of living which we indulge in is rather expensive. Mrs. Trotter cannot dispense with her tea and her other little comforts. At the same time, I must put you to no extra expense. I had rather be out of pocket myself. I propose that during the time you mess with us, you shall only pay 1 guinea per week. And as for entrance money, why, I think I must not charge you more than a couple of guineas. Have you any money?" "Yes," I replied, "I have 3 guineas and a half left." "Well, then, give me the 3 guineas, and the half-guinea you can reserve for pocket money. You must write to your friends immediately for a further supply." I handed him the money, which he put in his pocket. "Your chest," continued he, "you shall bring down here, for Mrs Trotter will, I am sure, if I request it, not only keep it in order for you, but see that your clothes are properly mended. She is a charming woman, Mrs Trotter, and very fond of young gentlemen. How old are you?" I replied that I was 15. "No more! Well, I am glad of that, for Mrs Trotter is very particular after a certain age. I should recommend you on no account to associate with the other midshipmen. They are very angry with me because I would not permit Mrs Trotter to join their mess, and they are sad story-tellers." "That they certainly are," replied I, but here we were interrupted by Mrs Trotter coming down with a piece of stick in her hand, upon which were skewered about a dozen small pieces of beef and pork, which she first laid on a plate, and then began to lay the cloth and prepare for dinner. "We have but a poor dinner to-day," said Mrs Trotter, "for the bumboat woman disappointed me. I particularly requested her to bring me off a leg of lamb, but she says that there was none in the market. It is rather early for it, that's true, but Trotter is very nice in his eating. Now let us sit down to dinner." I felt very sick indeed, and could eat nothing. Our dinner consisted of the pieces of beef and pork, the potatoes, and a baked pudding in a tin dish. Mr Trotter went up to serve the spirits out to the ship's company, and returned with a bottle of rum. "Have you got Mr Simple's allowance, my love?" inquired Mrs Trotter. "Yes, he is victualled to-day, as he came on board before 12 o'clock. Do you drink spirits, Mr Simple?" "No, I thank you," replied I, for I remembered the captain's injunction. "Taking, as I do, such an interest in your welfare, I must earnestly recommend you to abstain from them," said Mr Trotter. "It is a very bad habit, and once acquired not easy to be left off. I am obliged to drink them, that I may not check the perspiration after working in the hold. I have nevertheless a natural abhorrence of them, but my champagne and claret days are gone by, and I must submit to circumstances." "My poor Trotter!" said the lady. "Well," continued he, "it's a poor heart that never rejoiceth." He then poured out half a tumbler of rum, and filled the glass up with water. "My love, will you taste it?" "Now, Trotter, you know that I never touch it, except when the water is so bad that I must have the taste taken away. How is the water to-day?" "As usual, my dear, not drinkable." After much persuasion, Mrs Trotter agreed to sip a little out of his glass. I thought that she took it pretty often, considering that she did not like it, but I felt so unwell that I was obliged to go on the main deck. I went to bed very tired. Mr Trotter had my hammock hung up in the cockpit, separated by a canvas screen from the cot in which he slept with his wife. I thought this very odd, but they told me it was the general custom on board ship, although Mrs Trotter's delicacy was very much shocked by it. I was very sick, but Mrs Trotter was very kind. When I was in bed, she kissed me, and wished me good night, and very soon afterwards I fell fast asleep. End of chapter 5.
Chapter 6 of Peter Simple. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Sylvia M.B. in Washington State. Peter Simple by Frederick Marryat. Chapter 6. Puzzled with very common words. Mrs Trotter takes care of my wardrobe. A matrimonial duet ending con strepito. I awoke the next morning at daylight with a noise over my head which sounded like thunder. I found it proceeded from holystoning and washing down the main deck. I was very much refreshed nevertheless, and did not feel the least sick or giddy. Mr Trotter, who had been up at 4 o'clock, came down and directed one of the marines to fetch me some water. I washed myself on my chest, and then went on the main deck, which they were swabbing dry. Standing by the sentry at the cabin door, I met one of the midshipmen with whom I had been in company at the Blue Posts. "So, Master Simple, old Trotter and his faggot of a wife have got hold of you, have they?" said he. I replied that I did not know the meaning of faggot, but I considered Mrs Trotter a very charming woman, at which he burst into a loud laugh. "Well," said he, "I'll just give you a caution. Take care, or they'll make a clean sweep. Has Mrs Trotter showed you her ankle yet?" "Yes," I replied, "and a very pretty one it is." "Ah, she's at her old tricks. You had much better have joined our mess at once. You're not the first greenhorn that they have plucked." "Well," said he, as he walked away, "keep the key of your own chest, that's all." When he left me, I went on the quarter deck. All the sailors were busy at work, and the first lieutenant cried out to the gunner, "Now, Mr Dispart, if you're ready, we'll breach these guns." "Now, my lads," said the first lieutenant, "we must slew (the part the breeches cover) more forward." As I never heard of a gun having breeches, I was very anxious to see what was going on, and went up close to the first lieutenant, who said to me, "Youngster, hand me that monkey's tail." I saw nothing like a monkey's tail, but I was so frightened that I snatched up the first thing that I saw, which was a short bar of iron, and it so happened that it was the very article which he wanted. When I gave it to him, the first lieutenant looked at me and said, "So you know what a monkey's tail is already, do you? Now, don't you ever sham stupid after that." Thought I to myself, I'm very lucky, but if that's a monkey tail, it's a very stiff one. I resolved to learn the names of everything as fast as I could, that I might be prepared, so I listened attentively to what was said, but I soon became quite confused, and despaired of remembering anything. "Mr Chucks," said the first lieutenant to the boatswain, "what blocks have we below? Not on charge." "Let me see, sir. I've one sister, t'other we split in half the other day. I think I have a couple of monkeys down the store room. I say, you Smith, pass that brace through the bull's eye, and take the sheepshank out before you come down. And Mr Chucks, recollect this afternoon that you bleed all the boys." Bleed the boys, thought I. What can that be for? At all events, the surgeon appears to be the proper person to perform that operation. This last incomprehensible remark drove me off the deck, and I retreated to the cockpit, where I found Mrs Trotter. "Oh, my dear," said she, "I am glad you are come, as I wish to put your clothes in order. Have you a list of them? Where is your key?" I replied that I had not a list, and I handed her the key. Although I did not forget the caution of the midshipman, yet I considered that there could be no harm in her looking over my clothes when I was present. She unlocked my chest and pulled everything out, and then commenced telling me what were likely to be useful and what were not. "Now, these worsted stockings," she said, "will be very comfortable in cold weather, and in the summer time these brown cotton socks will be delightfully cool, and you have enough of each to last you till you outgrow them. But as for these fine cotton stockings, they are of no use, only catch the dirt when the decks are swept, and always look untidy. I wonder how they could be so foolish as to send them. Nobody wears them on board ship nowadays. They are only fit for women. I wonder if they would fit me." She turned her chair away, and put on one of my stockings, laughing the whole time. Then she turned round to me, and showed me how nicely they fitted her. "Bless you, Mr Simple, it's well the Trotter is in the hold. He'd be so jealous. Do you know what these stockings cost? They are of no use to you, and they fit me. I will speak to Trotter, and take them off your hands." I replied that I could not think of selling them, as they were of no use to me, and fitted her. I begged that she would accept of the dozen pairs. We had beefsteaks and onions for dinner that day, but I could not bear the smell of the onions. Mr Trotter came down very cross, because the first lieutenant had found fault with him. He swore that he would cut the service. He drank glass of grog after glass of grog, and at each glass became more violent. And Mrs Trotter drank also, I observed, a great deal more than I thought she ought to have done, but she whispered to me that she drank it that Trotter might not, as he would certainly be tipsy. I thought this very devoted on her part, but they sat so late that I went to bed and left them, he still drinking and vowing vengeance against the first lieutenant. I had not been asleep above 2 or 3 hours when I was awakened by a great noise and quarrelling, and I discovered that Mr Trotter was drunk and beating his wife. Very much shocked that such a charming woman should be beaten and ill used, I scrambled out of my hammock to see if I could be of any assistance, but it was dark, although they scuffled as much as before. I asked the marine, who was sentry at the gun room door above, to bring his lantern, and was very much shocked at his replying that I had better go to bed and let them fight it out. Shortly afterwards, Mrs Trotter staggered to my hammock, and after several attempts succeeded in getting into it. I cannot say that I much liked that, but what could I do? So I finished dressing myself and went up on the quarter deck. The midshipman who had the watch was the one who had cautioned me against the Trotters. He was very friendly to me, "Well, Semple," said he, "what brings you on deck?" I told him how ill Mr Trotter had behaved to his wife, and how she had turned into my hammock. "The cursed drunken old catamaran!" cried he. "I'll go and cut her down by the head." But I requested he would not, as she was a lady. "A lady!" replied he. "Yes, there's plenty of ladies of her description." And then he informed me that she had many years ago been the mistress of a man of fortune who kept a carriage for her, but that he grew tired of her, and had given Trotter £200 to marry her, and that now they did nothing but get drunk together and fight with each other. He went to my hammock and lowered it down at one end, so that Mrs Trotter lay with her head on the deck in a very uncomfortable position. To my astonishment, she swore at him in a dreadful manner, but refused to turn out. He was abusing her and shaking her in the hammock, when Mr Trotter, who had been aroused at the noise, rushed from behind the screen. "You villain, what are you doing with my wife?" cried he, pummelling at him as well as he could, for he was so tipsy that he could hardly stand. Mr Trotter was soon knocked down, when all of a sudden Mrs Trotter jumped up from the hammock and caught the midshipman by the hair and pulled at him. Then the sentry thought right to interfere. He called out for the master at arms, and went down himself to help the midshipman, who was faring badly between the two. But Mrs Trotter snatched the lantern out of his hand and smashed it all to pieces, and then we were all left in darkness, and I could not see what took place, although the scuffling continued. Such was the posture of affairs when the master at arms came up with his light. The midshipman and sentry went up the ladder, and Mr and Mrs Trotter continued beating each other. To this none of them paid any attention, saying, as the sentry had said before, "Let 'em fight it out." After they had fought some time, they retired behind the screen, and I followed the advice of the midshipman, and got into my hammock, which the master at arms hung up again for me. I heard Mr and Mrs Trotter both crying and kissing each other. "Cruel, cruel Mr Trotter," said she, blubbering. "My life, my love, I was so jealous," replied he. "Damn and blast your jealousy," replied the lady. "I've two nice black eyes for the galley to morrow." After about an hour of kissing and scolding, they both fell asleep again. The next morning before breakfast, the midshipman reported to the first lieutenant the conduct of Mr Trotter and his wife. I was sent for, and obliged to acknowledge that it was all true. He sent for Mr Trotter, who replied that he was not well, and could not come on deck; upon which the first lieutenant ordered the sergeant of marines to bring him up directly. Mr Trotter made his appearance with one eye closed, and his face very much scratched. "Did I not desire you, sir," said the first lieutenant, "to introduce this young gentleman into the midshipman's berth, instead of which you have introduced him to that disgraceful wife of yours, and have swindled him out of his property? I order you immediately to return the 3 guineas which you received as mess money, and also that your wife give back the stockings which she cajoled him out of." But then I interposed, and told the first lieutenant that the stockings had been a free gift on my part, and that although I had been very foolish, yet that I considered that I could not in honour demand them back again. "Well, youngster," replied the first lieutenant, "perhaps your ideas are correct, and if you wish it, I will not enforce that part of my order. But," continued he to Mr Trotter, "I desire, sir, that your wife leave the ship immediately, and I trust that when I have reported your conduct to the captain, he will serve you in the same manner. In the meantime, you will consider yourself under an arrest for drunkenness." Chapter 7 of Peter Simple. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Sylvia M.B. in Washington State. Peter Simple by Frederick Marryat. Chapter 7. Scandalum magnatum clearly proved. I proved to the captain that I consider him a gentleman, although I had told him the contrary, and I proved to the midshipmen that I am a gentleman myself. They proved their gratitude by practising upon me, because practice makes perfect. The captain came on board about 12 o'clock, and ordered the discharge of Mr Trotter to be made out, as soon as the first lieutenant had reported what had occurred. He then sent for all the midshipmen on the quarter deck. "Gentlemen," said the captain to them, with a stern countenance, "I feel very much indebted to some of you for the character which you have been pleased to give of me to Mr Simple. I must now request that you will answer a few questions which I am about to put in his presence. Did I ever flog the whole starboard watch, because the ship would only sail 9 knots on a bowline. No, sir, no, replied they all, very much frightened. Did I ever give a midshipman 4 dozen for not having his weekly accounts pipe-clayed, or another 5 dozen for wearing a scarlet watch riband? No, sir, replied they all together. Did any midshipman ever die on his chest from fatigue? They again replied in the negative. Then, gentlemen, you will oblige me by stating which of you thought proper to assert these falsehoods in the public coffee-room, and further, which of you obliged this youngster to risk his life in a duel? They were all silent. Will you answer me, gentlemen? With respect to the duel, sir, replied the midshipman who had fought me, I heard say that the pistols were only charged with powder. It was a joke. Well, sir, we'll allow that the duel was only a joke, and I hope and trust that your report is correct. Is the reputation of your captain only a joke? Allow me to ask. I request to know who of you dared to propagate such injurious slander. Here there was a dead pause. Well then, gentlemen, since you will not confess yourselves, I must refer to my authority. Mr. Simple, have the goodness to point out the person or persons who gave you the information. But I thought this would not be fair, and as they had all treated me very kindly after the duel, I resolved not to tell, so I answered, If you please, sir, I consider that I told you all that in confidence. Confidence, sir, replied the captain. Who ever heard of confidence between a post-captain and a midshipman? No, sir, replied I, not between a post-captain and a midshipman, but between 2 gentlemen. The captain bit his lip, and then turning to the midshipman said, You may thank Mr. Simple, gentlemen, that I do not press this matter further. I do believe that you were not serious when you calumniated me, but recollect that what is said in joke is too often repeated in earnest. I trust that Mr. Simple's conduct will have its effect, and that you will leave off practising upon him, who has saved you from a very severe punishment. When the midshipmen went down below, they all shook hands with me, and said that I was a good fellow for not peaching. But as for the advice of the captain, that they should not practise upon me, as he termed it, they forgot that, for they commenced again immediately, and never left off until they found that I was not to be deceived any longer. The postman came on board with the letters, and put his head into the midshipman's berth. I was very anxious to have one from home, but I was disappointed. Some had letters and some had not. Those who had not declared that their parents were very undutiful, and that they would cut them off without a shilling, and those who had letters, after they had read them, offered them for sale to the others, usually at half price. I could not imagine why they sold, or why the others bought them, but they did do so, and one that was full of good advice was sold 3 times, from which circumstance I was inclined to form a better opinion of the morals of my companions. I mentioned the reason why I was so anxious for a letter, namely, because I wanted to buy my dirk and cocked hat, upon which they told me that there was no occasion for my spending my money, as by the regulations of the service, the purser's steward served them out to all the officers who applied for them. As I knew where the purser's steward's room was, having seen it when down in the cockpit with the trotters, I went down immediately. Mr. Purser's steward, said I, let me have a cocked hat and a dirk immediately. Very good, sir, replied he, and he wrote an order upon a slip of paper, which he handed to me. There is the order for it, sir, but the cocked hats are kept in the chest up in the maintop, and as for the dirk, you must apply to the butcher, who has them under his charge. I went up with the order, and thought I would first apply for the dirk, so I inquired for the butcher, whom I found sitting in the sheep pen with the sheep, mending his trousers. In reply to my demand, he told me that he had not the key of the storeroom, which was under the charge of one of the corporals of marines. I inquired who, and he said Cheeks, the marine. This celebrated personage is the prototype of Mr. Nobody on board a man of war. I went everywhere about the ship inquiring for Cheeks the marine, but could not find him. Some said that they believed he was in the foretop, standing sentry over the wind, that it might not change. Others that he was in the galley, to prevent the midshipmen from soaking their biscuit in the captain's dripping pan. As I could not find the marine, I thought I might as well go for my cocked hat, and get my dirk afterwards. I did not much like going up the rigging, because I was afraid of turning giddy, and if I fell overboard I could not swim. But one of the midshipmen offered to accompany me, stating that I need not be afraid, if I fell overboard, of sinking to the bottom, as if I was giddy, my head at all events would swim. So I determined to venture. I climbed up very near to the main top, but not without missing the little ropes very often, and grazing the skin of my shins. Then I came to large ropes stretched out from the mast so that you must climb them with your head backwards. The midshipman told me these were called the cat harpings, because they were so difficult to climb that a cat would expostulate if ordered to go out by them. I was afraid to venture, and then he proposed that I should go through Lubber's Hole, which he said had been made for people like me. I agreed to attempt it, as it appeared more easy, and at last arrived quite out of breath, and very happy to find myself in the maintop. The captain of the maintop was there with 2 other sailors. The midshipman introduced me very politely. Mr. Jenkins, Mr. Simple, midshipman. Mr. Simple, Mr. Jenkins, captain of the maintop. Mr. Jenkins, Mr. Simple has come up with an order for a cocked hat. The captain of the top replied that he was very sorry that he had not one in store, but the last had been served out to the captain's monkey. This was very provoking. The captain of the top then asked me if I was ready with my footing. I replied, not very, for I had lost it 2 or 3 times when coming up. He laughed and replied that I should lose it altogether before I went down, and that I must hand it out. Hand out my footing? Said I, puzzled, and appealing to the midshipman. What does he mean? He means that you must fork out a 7-shilling bit. I was just as wise as ever, and stared very much. When Mr. Jenkins desired the other men to get 6 foxes and make a spread eagle of me, unless he had his parcasite, I never should have found out what it all meant, had not the midshipman, who laughed till he cried, at last informed me that it was the custom to give the men something to drink the first time that I came aloft, and that if I did not, they would tie me up to the rigging. Having no money in my pocket, I promised to pay them as soon as I went below, but Mr. Jenkins would not trust me. Why, sir, said I, do you know who you are speaking to? I am an officer and a gentleman. Do you know who my grandfather is? Oh, yes, replied he. Very well. Then who is he, sir? Replied I, very angrily. Who is he? Why, he's the Lord knows who. No, replied I, that's not his name. He is Lord Privilege. I was very much surprised that he knew that my grandfather was a lord. And do you suppose, continued I, that I would forfeit the honour of my family for a paltry 7 shillings? This observation of mine, and a promise on the part of the midshipman, who said he would be bail for me, satisfied Mr. Jenkins, and he allowed me to go down the rigging. I went to my chest and paid the 7 shillings to one of the topmen who followed me, and then went up on the main deck to learn as much as I could of my profession. End of chapter 7. Chapter 8 of Peter Simple. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Sylvia M.B. in Washington State. Peter Simple by Frederick Marryat. Chapter 8. My messmates show me the folly of running in debt. The episode of Sholto McFoy. Now that I had been on board about a month, I find that my life is not disagreeable. I don't smell the pitch and tar, and I can get into my hammock without tumbling out on the other side. My messmates are good-tempered, although they laugh at me very much. But I must say that they are not very nice in their ideas of honour. A few days after I came on board, I purchased some tarts of the bumboat woman, as she is called. I wished to pay for them, but she had no change, and very civilly told me she would trust me. She produced a narrow book, and said that she would open an account with me, and I could pay her when I thought proper. To this arrangement I had no objection, and I sent up for different things until I thought that my account must have amounted to 11 or 12 shillings. As I promised my father that I never would run in debt, I considered that it was then time that it should be settled. When I asked for it, what was my surprise to find that it amounted to £2 14 shillings 6 pence. I declared that it was impossible, and requested that she would allow me to look at the items, when I found that I was booked for at least 3 or 4 dozen tarts every day, ordered by the young gentleman, to be put down to Mr. Simple's account. I was very much shocked, not only at the sum of money which I had to pay, but also at the want of honesty on the part of my messmates. But when I complained of it in the berth, they all laughed at me. At last one of them said, "Peter, tell the truth. Did not your father caution you not to run in debt?" "Yes, he did," replied I. "I know that very well," replied he. "All fathers do the same when their sons leave them. It's a matter of course. Now observe, Peter. It is out of regard to you that your messmates have been eating tarts at your expense. You disobeyed your father's injunctions before you had been a month from home, and it is to give you a lesson that may be useful in after life, that they have considered it their duty to order the tarts. I trust that it will not be thrown away upon you. Go to the woman, pay your bill, and never run up another." "That I certainly shall not," replied I; but as I could not prove who ordered the tarts, and did not think it fair that the woman should lose her money, I went up and paid the bill, with a determination never to open an account with anybody again. But this left my pockets quite empty, so I wrote to my father, stating the whole transaction and the consequent state of my finances. My father, in his answer, observed that whatever might have been their motives, my messmates had done me a friendly act, and that as I had lost my money by my own carelessness, I must not expect that he would allow me any more pocket money. But my mother, who added a postscript to his letter, slipped in a £5 note, and I do believe that it was with my father's sanction, although he pretended to be very angry at my forgetting his injunctions. A few days before this, Mr Falcon, the first lieutenant, ordered me to put on my side arms to go away on duty. I replied that I had neither dirk nor cocked hat, although I had applied for them. He laughed at my story, and sent me on shore with the master, who bought them, and the first lieutenant sent up the bill to my father, who paid it, and wrote to thank him for his trouble. That morning the first lieutenant said to me, "Now, Mr Simple, we'll take the shine off that cocked hat and dirk of yours. You will go in the boat with Mr O'Brien, and take care that none of the men slip away from it and get drunk at the tap." This was the first time that I had ever been sent away on duty, and I was very proud of being an officer in charge. I put on my full uniform, and was ready at the gangway a quarter of an hour before the men were piped away. We were ordered to the dockyard to draw sea stores. When we arrived there, I was quite astonished at the piles of timber, the ranges of storehouses, and the immense anchors which lay on the wharf. There was such a bustle, everybody appeared to be so busy, that I wanted to look every way at once. Close to where the boat landed, they were hauling a large frigate out of what they called the basin, and I was so interested with the sight, that I am sorry to say I quite forgot all about the boat's crew, and my orders to look after them. 2 of the men belonging to the boat slipped away, and on my return they were not to be seen. I was very much frightened, for I knew that I had neglected my duty, and that on the first occasion on which I had been entrusted with responsible service. What to do I did not know. I ran up and down every part of the dockyard, until I was quite out of breath, asking everybody I met whether they had seen my 2 men. Many of them said that they had seen plenty of men, but did not exactly know mine. Some laughed and called me a greenhorn. At last I met a midshipman, who told me that he had seen 2 men answering to my description on the roof of the coach starting for London, and that I must be quick if I wished to catch them, but he would not stop to answer any more questions. I was proceeding on very disconsolately, when, as I turned a corner, to my great delight, I met my 2 men, who touched their hats and said that they had been looking for me. I did not believe that they told the truth, but I was so glad to recover them that I did not scold, but went with them down to the boat, which had been waiting some time for us. O'Brien, the master's mate, called me a young sculping, a word I had never heard before. When we arrived on board, the first lieutenant asked O'Brien why he had remained so long. He answered that 2 of the men had left the boat, but that I had found them. The first lieutenant appeared to be pleased with me, observing, as he had said before, that I was no fool, and I went down below overjoyed at my good fortune, and very much obliged to O'Brien for not telling the whole truth. On a day or 2 afterwards, we had a new messmate of the name of McFoy. I was on the quarter deck when he came on board, and presented a letter to the captain, inquiring first if his name was Captain Sauvage. He was a florid young man, nearly 6 feet high, with sandy hair, yet very good looking. As his career in the service was very short, I will tell at once what I did not find out till some time afterwards. The captain had agreed to receive him to oblige a brother officer, who had retired from the service and lived in the Highlands of Scotland. The first notice which the captain had of the arrival of Mr McFoy was from a letter written to him by the young man's uncle. This amused him so much that he gave it to the first lieutenant to read. It ran as follows: Glasgow, April 25th. Sir, our much esteemed and mutual friend Captain McAlpine, having communicated by letter, dated the 14th instant, Your kind intentions relative to my nephew, Sholto McFoy, for which you will be pleased to accept my best thanks. I write to acquaint you that he is now on his way to join your ship, the Diomede, and will arrive, God willing, 26 hours after the receipt of this letter. As I have been given to understand by those who have some acquaintance with the service of the king, that his equipment as an officer will be somewhat expensive, I have considered it but fair to ease your mind as to any responsibility on that score, and have therefore enclosed the half of a Bank of England note for £10 sterling, number 3742, the other half of which will be duly forwarded in a frank promised to me the day after tomorrow. I beg you will make the necessary purchases, and apply the balance, should there be any, to his mess account, or any other expenses which you may consider warrantable or justifiable. It is at the same time proper to inform you that Sholto had 10 shillings in his pocket at the time of his leaving Glasgow, the satisfactory expenditure of which I have no doubt you will inquire into, as it is a large sum to be placed at the discretion of a youth only 14 years and 5 months old. I mention his age, as Sholto is so tall that you might be deceived by his appearance, and be induced to trust to his prudence in affairs of this serious nature. Should he at any time require further assistance beyond his pay, which I am told is extremely handsome to all king's officers, I beg you to consider that any draft of yours, at 10 days' sight, to the amount of £5 sterling English, will be duly honoured by the firm of Monteith, Killip and Company of Glasgow. Sir, with many thanks for your kindness and consideration, I remain your most obedient, Walter Monteith. The letter brought on board by McFoy was to prove his identity. While the captain read it, McFoy stared at him like a wild stag. The captain welcomed him to the ship, asked him 1 or 2 questions, introduced him to the first lieutenant, and then went on shore. The first lieutenant had asked me to dine in the gun room. I supposed that he was pleased with me because I had found the men, and when the captain pulled on shore, he also invited Mr. McFoy, when the following conversation took place. "Well, Mr. McFoy, you have had a long journey. I presume it is the first that you have ever made?" "Indeed it is, sir," replied McFoy, "and sorely I've been pestered. Had I minded all they whispered in my lug as I came along, I had need been made of money. Saxpence here, saxpence there, saxpence everywhere. Sich extortion I ne'er dreamed of." "How did you come from Glasgow?" "By the wheelboat, or steamboat as they ca'd it, to London, where they charged me saxpence for taking my baggage on shore. A wee boxy nae bigger than yon cocked up hat. I would fain carry it mysel', but they wouldna let me." "How much of your 10 shillings have you left?" inquired the first lieutenant, smiling. "Hoot, Sir Lieutenant, how came you for to ken that? It's my uncle Monteith at Glasgow. Why, as I sit here, I've but 3 shillings and a penny of it left, but there's a smell here that's no canny, so I'll just go up again into the fresh air." When Mr. McFoy quitted the gun room, they all laughed very much. After he had been a short time on deck, he went down into the midshipman's berth, but he made himself very unpleasant, quarrelling and wrangling with everybody. It did not, however, last very long, for he would not obey any orders that were given to him. On the 3rd day he quitted the ship without asking the permission of the first lieutenant. When he returned on board the following day, the first lieutenant put him under an arrest, and in charge of the sentry at the cabin door. During the afternoon I was under the half deck, and perceived that he was sharpening a long clasp knife upon the after truck of the gun. I went up to him, and asked him why he was doing so, and he replied, as his eyes flashed fire, that it was to avenge the insult offered to the blood of the McFoy. His look told me that he was in earnest. I was very much alarmed, and thought it my duty to state his murderous intentions, or worse might happen. So I walked up on deck and told the first lieutenant what McFoy was intending to do. Mr. Falcon laughed, and shortly afterwards went down on the main deck. McFoy's eyes glistened, and he walked forward to where the first lieutenant was standing, but the sentry, who had been cautioned by me, kept him back with his bayonet. The first lieutenant turned round, and perceiving what was going on, desired the sentry to see if Mr. McFoy had a knife in his hands, and he had it, sure enough, open and held behind his back. He was disarmed, and the first lieutenant, perceiving that the lad meant mischief, reported his conduct to the captain on his arrival on board. The captain sent for McFoy, who was very obstinate, and when taxed with his intentions would not deny it, or even say that he would not again attempt it. So he was sent on shore immediately, and returned to his friends in the Highlands. We never saw any more of him, but I heard that he obtained a commission in the army, and 3 months after he had joined his regiment was killed in a duel, resenting some fancied affront offered to the blood of McFoy. End of chapter 8. Chapter 9 of Peter Simple. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Sylvia M.B. in Washington State. Peter Simple by Frederick Marryat. Chapter 9. We post up to Portsdown Fair. Consequence of disturbing a lady at supper. Spontaneous combustion at Ranelagh Gardens. Pastry versus piety. Many are bid to the feast, but not the halt, the lame, or the blind. A few days after McFoy quitted the ship, we all had leave from the first lieutenant to go to Portsdown Fair, but he would only allow the oldsters to sleep on shore. We anticipated so much pleasure from our excursion, that some of us were up early enough to go away in the boat sent for fresh beef. We had our breakfast, and went up George Street, where we found all sorts of vehicles ready to take us to the fair. We got into one which they called a dilly. I asked the man who drove it why it was so called, and he replied, because he only charged a shilling. O'Brien, who had joined us after breakfasting on board, said that this answer reminded him of one given to him by a man who attended the hackney coach stands in London. "Pray," said he, "why are you called waterman?" "Waterman," replied the man, "why, sir, 'cause we opens the hackney coach doors." At last, with plenty of whipping and plenty of swearing and a great deal of laughing, the old horse, whose back curved upwards like a bow from the difficulty of dragging so many, arrived at the bottom of Portsdown Hill, where we got out and walked up to the fair. There was Richardson with a clown and harlequin, and such beautiful women, dressed in clothes all over gold spangles, dancing reels and waltzes, and looking so happy. There was Flint and Gingell, with fellows tumbling over heads and heels, playing such tricks, eating fire, and drawing yards of tape out of their mouths. Then there was the Royal Circus, all the horses standing in a line, with men and women standing on their backs waving flags, while the trumpeters blew their trumpets. We walked about for an hour or two, seeing the outside of everything. We determined to go and see the inside. First we went into Richardson's, where we saw a bloody tragedy, with a ghost and thunder, and afterwards a pantomime, full of tricks and tumbling over one another. Then we saw one or two other things, I forget what, but this I know, that generally speaking, the outside was better than the inside. After this, feeling very hungry, we agreed to go into a booth and have something to eat. The tables were ranged all around, and in the centre there was a boarded platform for dancing. The ladies were there already dressed for partners, and the music was so lively that I felt very much inclined to dance, but we had agreed to go and see the wild beasts fed at Mr. Polito's menagerie, and as it was now almost 8 o'clock, we paid our bill and set off. It was a very curious sight, and better worth seeing than anything in the fair. I never had an idea that there were so many strange animals in existence. There was a tapir, a great pig with a long nose, and a variety of the hippopotamus, which the keeper said was an amphibilious animal, as couldn't live on land, and dies in the water. However, it seemed to live very well in a cage. Then there was the kangaroo, with its young ones peeping out of it, a most astonishing animal. The keeper said that it brought forth 2 young ones at a birth, and then took them into its stomach again, until they arrived at years of discretion. Then there was the pelican of the wilderness, with a large bag under his throat, which the man put on his head as a nightcap. This bird feeds its young with its own blood when fish are scarce. There were a young elephant, and 3 lions, and several other animals which I forget now, so I shall go on to describe the tragical scene which occurred. The keeper had poked up all the animals, and had commenced feeding them. The great lion was growling and snarling over the shin bone of an ox, cracking it like a nut, when by some mismanagement, one end of the pole upon which the chandelier was suspended fell down, striking the door of the cage in which the lioness was at supper, and bursting it open. It was all done in a second. The chandelier fell, the cage opened, the lioness sprang out. I remember to this moment seeing the body of the lioness in the air, and then all was dark as pitch. What a change! Not a moment before, all of us staring with delight and curiosity, and then to be left in darkness, horror and dismay. There was such screaming and shrieking, such crying and fighting and pushing and fainting, nobody knew where to go or how to find their way out. The people crowded first on one side and then on the other, as their fears instigated them. I was very soon jammed up with my back against the bars of one of the cages, and feeling some beast lay hold of me behind, made a desperate effort, and succeeded in climbing up to the cage above, not however without losing the seat of my trousers, which the laughing hyena would not let go. I hardly knew where I was when I climbed up. I was surmising what danger I should next encounter, when to my joy I discovered that I had gained the open door from which the lioness had escaped. I crawled in and pulled the door to after me, thinking myself very fortunate, and there I sat very quietly in a corner during the remainder of the noise and confusion. I had been there but a few minutes, when the beef eaters, as they were called, who played the music outside, came in with torches and loaded muskets. No one was seriously hurt. As for the lioness, she was not to be found, and as soon as it was ascertained that she had escaped, there was as much terror and scampering away outside as there had been in the menagerie. It appeared afterwards that the animal had been as much frightened as we had been, and had secreted herself under one of the wagons. It was some time before she could be found. At last O'Brien, who was a very brave fellow, went ahead of the beef eaters and saw her eyes glaring. They borrowed a net or two from the carts which had brought calves to the fair, and threw them over her, and when she was fairly entangled, they dragged her by the tail into the menagerie. All this while I had remained very quietly in the den, but when I perceived that its lawful owner had come back to retake possession, I thought it was time to come out. So I called to my messmates, who with O'Brien were assisting the beef eaters. They had not discovered me, and laughed very much when they saw where I was. One of the midshipmen shot the bolt of the door so that I could not jump out, and then stirred me up with a long pole. At last I contrived to unbolt it again and got out, when they laughed still more at the seat of my trousers being torn off. It was not exactly a laughing matter to me, although I had to congratulate myself upon a very lucky escape, and so did my messmates think when I narrated my adventures. O'Brien lent me a dark silk handkerchief, which I tied round my waist and let drop behind, so that my misfortunes might not attract any notice. We then went to what they called the Ranelagh Gardens, to see the fireworks, which were to be let off at 10 o'clock. It was exactly 10 when we paid for our admission, and we waited very patiently for a quarter of an hour, but there were no signs of the fireworks being displayed. The fact was, that the man to whom the gardens belonged waited until more company should arrive, although the place was already very full of people. Now the first lieutenant had ordered the boat to wait for us until 12 o'clock, and then return on board, and as we were 7 miles from Portsmouth, we had not much time to spare. We waited another quarter of an hour, and then it was agreed that as the fireworks were stated in the handbill to commence precisely at 10 o'clock, we were fully justified in letting them off ourselves. O'Brien went out, and returned with a dozen penny rattans, which he notched in the end. The fireworks were on the posts and stages, all ready, and it was agreed that we should light them all at once, and then mix with the crowd. The oldsters lighted the cigars, and fixing them in the notched end of the canes, continued to puff them until they were all well lighted. They handed one to each of us, and at a signal we all applied them to the match papers, and as soon as the fire communicated, we threw down our canes and ran in among the crowd. In about half a minute, off they all went in the most beautiful confusion. There were silver stars and golden stars, blue lights and Catherine wheels, mines and bombs, Grecian fires and Roman candles, Chinese trees, rockets, and illuminated mottos, all firing away, cracking, popping, and fizzing at the same time. We all escaped very cleverly, and taking another dilly, arrived at Portsmouth, and were down to the boat in good time. Sunday being a fine day, we all went on shore to church with Mr Falcon, the first lieutenant. We liked going to church very much, not, I am sorry to say, from religious feelings, but for the following reason. The first lieutenant sat in a pew below, and we were placed in the gallery above, where he could not see us, nor indeed could we see him. We all remained very quiet, and I may say very devout, during the time of the service, but the clergyman who delivered the sermon was so tedious, and had such a bad voice, that we generally slipped out as soon as he went up into the pulpit, and adjourned to the pastry cook's opposite, to eat cakes and tarts and drink cherry brandy, which we infinitely preferred to hearing a sermon. Somehow or other the first lieutenant had scented our proceedings. We believed that the marine officer informed against us, and this Sunday he served us a pretty trick. We had been at the pastry cook's as usual, and as soon as we perceived the people coming out of church, we put all our tarts and sweetmeats into our hats, which we then slipped on our heads, and took our station at the church door, as if we had just come down from the gallery, and had been waiting for him. Instead, however, of appearing at the church door, he walked up the street, and desired us to follow him to the boat. The fact was, he had been in the back room at the pastry cook's, watching our motions through the green blinds. We had no suspicion, but thought that he had come out of the church a little sooner than usual. When we arrived on board and followed him up the side, he said to us as we came on deck, "Walk aft, young gentlemen." We did, and he desired us to tow a line, which means to stand in a row. "Now, Mr. Dixon," said he, "what was the text today?" As he very often asked us that question, we always left one in the church until the text was given out, who brought it to us at the pastry cook's shop, when we all marked it in our Bibles, to be ready if he asked us. Dixon immediately pulled out his Bible, where he had marked down the leaf, and read it. "Oh, that was it," said Mr. Falcon. "You must have remarkably good ears, Mr. Dixon, to have heard the clergyman from the pastry cook's shop. Now, gentlemen, hats off, if you please." We all slided off our hats, which, as he expected, were full of pastry. "Really, gentlemen," said he, feeling the different papers of pastry and sweetmeats, "I am quite delighted to perceive that you have not been to church for nothing. Few come away with so many good things pressed upon their seat of memory. Master at arms, send all the ship's boys aft." The boys all came tumbling up the ladders, and the first lieutenant desired each of them to take a seat upon the carronade slides. When they were all stationed, he ordered us to go round with our hats and request of each his acceptance of a tart, which we were obliged to do, handing first to one and then to another, until the hats were all empty. What annoyed me more than all was the grinning of the boys at their being served by us like footmen, as well as the ridicule and laughter of the whole ship's company, who had assembled at the gangways. When all the pastry was devoured, the first lieutenant said, "There, gentlemen, now that you have had your lesson for the day, you may go below." We could not help laughing ourselves when we went down into the berth. End of chapter 9. Chapter 10 of Peter Simple. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Sylvia M.P. in Washington State. Peter Simple by Frederick Marryat. Chapter 10. A press gang beaten off by one woman. Dangers at Spithead and Point. A treat for both parties of pulled chicken at my expense. Also gin for 20. I am made a prisoner. Escape and rejoin my ship. I must now relate what occurred to me a few days before the ship sailed. We were reported ready for sea, and the Admiralty was anxious that we should proceed. The only obstacle to our sailing was, that we had not yet completed our complement of men. The captain applied to the port admiral, and obtained permission to send parties on shore to impress seamen. The second and third lieutenants, and the oldest midshipmen, were despatched on shore every night with some of the most trustworthy men, and generally brought on board in the morning about half a dozen men, whom they had picked up in the different ale houses or grog shops, as the sailors call them. I had a great wish to be one of the party before the ship sailed, and asked O'Brien, who was very kind to me in general, and allowed nobody to thrash me but himself, if he would take me with him, which he did on the night after I had made the request. I put on my dirk, that they might know I was an officer, as well as for my protection. About dusk we rowed on shore and landed on the Gosport side. The men were all armed with cutlasses, and wore pea jackets, which are very short great coats, made of what they call flushing. We did not stop to look at any of the grog shops in the town, as it was too early, but walked out about 3 miles in the suburbs, and went to a house, the door of which was locked, but we forced it open in a minute, and hastened to enter the passage, where we found the landlady standing to defend the entrance. The passage was long and narrow, and she was a very tall, corpulent woman, so that her body nearly filled it up, and in her hand she held a long spit pointed at us, with which she kept us at bay. The officers, who were the foremost, did not like to attack a woman, and she made such drives at them with her spit, that had they not retreated, some of them would soon have been ready for roasting. The sailors laughed and stood outside, leaving the officers to settle the business how they could. At last the landlady called out to her husband, "Be they all out, Jem?" "Yes," replied the husband, "they be all safe gone." "Well then," replied she, "I'll soon have all these gone too." And with these words she made such rush forward upon us with her spit, that had we not fallen back and tumbled one over another, she certainly would have run it through the second lieutenant, who commanded the party. The passage was cleared in an instant, and as soon as we were all in the street she bolted us out. So there we were, 3 officers and 15 armed men, fairly beat off by a fat old woman, the sailors who had been drinking in the house having made their escape to some other place. We then called at other houses, where we picked up 1 or 2 men, but most of them escaped by getting out at the windows or back doors as we entered the front. Now there was a grog shop, which was very favourite rendezvous of the seamen belonging to the merchant vessels, and to which they were accustomed to retreat when they heard that the press gangs were out. Our officers were aware of this, and were therefore indifferent as to the escape of the man, as they knew that they would all go to that place, and confide in their numbers for beating us off. As it was then 1 o'clock, they thought it time to go there. We proceeded without any noise, but they had people on the lookout, and as soon as we turned the corner of the lane, the alarm was given. I was afraid that they would all run away, and we should lose them, but on the contrary, they mustered very strong on that night, and resolved to give fight. The men remained in the house, but an advance guard of about 30 of their wives saluted us with a shower of stones and mud. Some of our sailors were hurt, but they did not appear to mind what the women did. They rushed on, and then they were attacked by the women with their fists and nails. Notwithstanding this, the sailors only laughed, pushing the women on one side, and saying, "Be quiet, Paul. Don't be foolish, Molly. Out of the way, Sukey. We ain't come to take away your fancy, man," with expressions of that sort, although the blood trickled down many of their faces from the way in which they had been clawed. We at length got into the house. The seamen of the merchant ships had armed themselves with bludgeons and other weapons, and had taken a position on the tables. They were more than 2 to 1 against us, and there was a dreadful fight, as their resistance was very desperate. Our sailors were obliged to use their cutlasses, and for a few minutes I was quite bewildered with the shouting and swearing, pushing and scuffling, collaring and fighting, together with the dust raised up, which not only blinded but nearly choked me. By the time that my breath was nearly squeezed out of my body, our sailors got the best of it, which the landlady and women of the house perceiving, they put out all the lights, so that I could not tell where I was, but our sailors had every one seized his man, and contrived to haul him out of the street door, where they were collected together and secured. Now again I was in great difficulty. I had been knocked down and trod upon, and when I did contrive to get up again, I did not know the direction in which the door lay. I felt about by the wall, and at last came to a door, for the room at that time was nearly empty, and the women having followed the men out of the house, I opened it, and found that it was not the right one, but led into a little side parlour, where there was a fire, but no lights. I had just discovered my mistake, and was about to retreat, when I was shoved in from behind, and the key turned upon me. There I was, all alone, and, I must acknowledge, very much frightened, as I thought that the vengeance of the women would be wreaked upon me. I peeped through the keyhole, and perceived that the candles were relighted, and that there were only women in the room, who were talking all at once, and not thinking about me. But in a minute or two a woman came in from the street, with her long black hair hanging about her shoulders, and her cap in her hand. "Well," cried she, "they've nabbed my husband, but I'll be dished if I haven't boxed up the midshipmite in that parlour, and he shall take his place." I thought I should have died when I looked at the woman, and perceived her coming up to the door, followed by some others, to unlock it. As the door opened, I drew my dirk, resolving to die like an officer, and as they advanced, I retreated to a corner, brandishing my dirk without saying a word. "Well," cried the woman who had made me a prisoner, "I do declare I likes to see a puddle in a storm. Only look at the little biscuit nibbler showing fight. Come, my lovely, you belongs to me." "Never!" exclaimed I, with indignation. "Keep off, or I shall do you a mischief." And I raised my dirk in advance. "I am an officer and a gentleman." "Sal," cried the odious woman, "fetch a mop and a pail of dirty water, and I'll trundle that dirk out of his fist." "No, no," replied another rather good looking young woman. "Leave him to me. Don't hurt him. He really is a very nice little man. What's your name, my dear?" "Peter Simple is my name," replied I, "and I am a king's officer, so be careful what you are about." "Don't be afraid, Peter. Nobody shall hurt you, but you must not draw your dirk before ladies. That's not like an officer and a gentleman. So put up your dirk, that's a good boy." "I will not," replied I, "unless you promise me that I shall go away unmolested." I do promise you that you shall, upon my word. But recollect, Peter, that you are an officer and a gentleman. You surely would not be so shabby as to go away without treating us. What money have you got in your pocket?" And without giving me time to answer, she felt in my pocket and pulled out my purse, which she opened. "Why, Peter, you are as rich as a Jew," said she, and they counted 30 shillings on the table. "Now, what shall we have?" "Anything you please," said I, "provided that you will let me go." "Well, then, it shall be a gallon of gin. Sal, call Mrs Flanagan. Mrs Flanagan, we want a gallon of gin and clean glasses." Mrs Flanagan received the major part of my money, and in a minute returned with the gin and wine glasses. "Now, Peter, my dove, let's all draw round the table and make ourselves cosy." "Oh, no," replied I. "Take my money, drink the gin, but pray let me go." But they wouldn't listen to me. Then I was obliged to sit down with them. The gin was poured out, and they made me drink a glass, which nearly choked me. It had, however, one good effect. It gave me courage, and in a minute or two I felt as if I could fight them all. The door of the room was on the same side as the fireplace, and I perceived that the poker was between the bars, and red hot. I complained that it was cold, although I was in a burning fever, and they allowed me to get up to warm my hands. As soon as I reached the fireplace, I snatched out the red hot poker, and brandishing it over my head, made for the door. They all jumped up to detain me, but I made a poke at the foremost, which made her run back with a shriek. I do believe that I burnt her nose. I seized my opportunity and escaped into the street, whirling the poker round my head, while all the women followed, hooting and shouting after me. I never stopped running and whirling my poker until I was reeking with perspiration, and the poker was quite cold. Then I looked back and found that I was alone. It was very dark. Every house was shut up, and not a light to be seen anywhere. I stopped at the corner, not knowing where I was or what I was to do. I felt very miserable indeed, and was reflecting on my wisest plan, when who should turn the corner but one of the quartermasters, who had been left on shore by accident. I knew him by his pea jacket and straw hat to be one of our men, and I was delighted to see him. I told him what had happened, and he replied that he was going to a house where the people knew him and would let me in. When we arrived there, the people of the house were very civil. The landlady made us some purl, which the quartermaster ordered, and which I thought was very good indeed. After we had finished the jug, we both fell asleep in our chairs. I did not awaken until I was roused by the quartermaster at past 7 o'clock, when we took a wherry and went off to the ship. End of chapter 10. Chapter 11 of Peter Simple. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Sylvia M.B. in Washington State. Peter Simple by Frederick Marryat. Chapter 11. O'Brien takes me under his protection. The ship's company are paid. So are the bumboat women, the Jews, and the emancipationist after a fashion. We go to sea. Dr. O'Brien's cure for seasickness. 1 pill of the doctor's more than a dose. When we arrived, I reported myself to the first lieutenant, and told him the whole story of the manner in which I had been treated, showing him the poker which I brought on board with me. He heard me very patiently, and then said, "Mr Simple, you may be the greatest fool of your family for all I know to the contrary, but never pretend to be a fool with me. That poker proves the contrary, and if your wit can serve you upon your own emergency, I expect that it will be employed for the benefit of the service." He then sent for O'Brien, and gave him a lecture for allowing me to go with the press gang, pointing out, what was very true, that I could have been of no service, and might have met with a serious accident. At last the frigate was full manned, and, as we had received drafts of men from other ships, we were ordered to be paid previously to our going to sea. The people on shore always find out when a ship is to be paid, and very early in the morning we were surrounded with wherries laden with Jews and other people, some requesting admittance to sell their goods, others to get paid for what they had allowed the sailors to take up upon credit. But the first lieutenant would not allow any of them to come on board until after the ship was paid, although they were so urgent, that he was forced to place sentries in the chains with cold shot, and to stave the boats if they came alongside. About 11 o'clock, the dockyard boat, with all the pay clerks and the cashier, with his chest of money, came on board, and was shown into the fore cabin, where the captain attended the pay table. The men were called in one by one, and as the amount and wages due had been previously calculated, they were paid very fast. The money was always received in their hats, after it had been counted out in the presence of the officers and captain. Outside the cabin door there stood a tall man in black, with hair straight combed, who had obtained an order from the port admiral to be permitted to come on board. He attacked every sailor as he came out, with his money in his hat, for a subscription to emancipate the slaves in the West Indies. But the sailors would not give him anything, swearing that the niggers were better off than they were, for they did not work harder by day, and had no watch and watch to keep during the night. "Servitude is servitude all over the world, my old psalm singer," replied one. "They sarve their masters, as in duty bound we sarve the king, 'cause he can't do without us, and he never axes our leave, but helps himself." Then the purser's steward came out. He was what they call a bit of a lawyer, that is, had received more education than the seamen in general. "I trust, sir," said the man in black, "that you will contribute something." "Not I, my hearty. I owe every farthing of my money, and more too, I'm afraid." "Still, sir, a small trifle." "Why, what an infernal rascal you must be, to ask a man to give away what is not his own property. Did I not tell you that I owed it all? There's an old proverb, be just before you're generous. Now it's my opinion that you are a methodistical, good-for-nothing blackguard, and if any one is such a fool as to give you money, you will keep it for yourself." When the man found that he could obtain nothing at the door, he went down on the lower deck, and commenced distributing prints of a black man kneeling in chains, and saying, "Am I not your brother?" Some of the men laughed, and swore that they would paste their brother up in the mess to say prayers for the ship's company, but others were very angry and abused him. At last one man, who was tipsy, came up to him. "Do you pretend for to insinivate that this crying black thief is my brother?" "To be sure I do," replied the Methodist. "Then take that for your infernal lie," said the sailor, hitting him in the face right and left, and knocking the man down into the cable tier, from whence he climbed up, and made his escape out of the frigate as soon as he was able. The ship was now in a state of confusion and uproar. There were Jews trying to sell clothes, or to obtain money for clothes which they had sold, bumboat men and bumboat women showing their long bills, and demanding or coaxing for payment. Other people from the shore, with hundreds of small debts, and the sailors' wives sticking close to them and disputing every bill presented, as an extortion or a robbery. There were such bawling and threatening, laughing and crying, for the women were all to quit the ship before sunset. At one moment a Jew was upset, and all his hamper of clothes tossed into the hold. At another, a sailor was seen hunting everywhere for a Jew who had cheated him, all squabbling or skylarking, and many of them very drunk. It appeared to me that the sailors had rather a difficult point to settle. They had three claimants upon them: the Jew for clothes, the bumboat men for their mess in the harbour, and their wives for their support during their absence, and the money which they received was, generally speaking, not more than sufficient to meet one of the demands. As it may be supposed, the women had the best of it. The others were paid a trifle, and promised the remainder when they came back from their cruise. About 5 o'clock the orders were given for the ship to be cleared. All disputed points were settled by the sergeant of marines, with a party who divided their antagonist from the Jews, and every description of persons not belonging to the ship, whether male or female, was dismissed over the side. The hammocks were piped down, those who were intoxicated were put to bed, and the ship was once more quiet. The next day everything was prepared for sea, and no leave was permitted to the officers. Stock of every kind was brought on board, and the large boats hoisted and secured. On the morning after, at daylight, a signal from the flagship in harbour was made for us to unmoor. Our orders had come down to cruise in the Bay of Biscay. The captain came on board, the anchor weighed, and we ran through the Needles with a fine northeast breeze. What occurred for the next 6 days I cannot tell. I thought that I should die every moment, and lay in my hammock or on the chests for the whole of that time, incapable of eating, drinking, or walking about. O'Brien came to me on the 7th morning, and said that if I did not exert myself, I never should get well, and that he was very fond of me, and had taken me under his protection, and to prove his regard, he would do for me what he would not take the trouble to do for any other youngster in the ship, which was to give me a good basting, which was a sovereign remedy for seasickness. He suited the action to the word, and drubbed me on the ribs without mercy until I thought the breath was out of my body, and then he took out a rope's end and thrashed me until I obeyed his orders to go on deck immediately. Before he came to me, I could never have believed it possible that I could have obeyed him, but somehow or another I did contrive to crawl up the ladder to the main deck, where I sat down on the shot racks and cried bitterly. But by degrees I recovered myself, and certainly felt a great deal better, and that night I slept very soundly. The next morning O'Brien came to me again. "It's a nasty slow fever, that seasickness, my Peter, and we must drive it out of you." And then he commenced a repetition of yesterday's remedy until I was almost a jelly. Whether the fear of being thrashed drove away my seasickness, or whatever might be the real cause of it, I do not know, but this is certain, that I felt no more of it after the second beating, and the next morning when I awoke I was very hungry. I hastened to dress myself before O'Brien came to me, and did not see him until we met at breakfast. "Peter," said he, "let me feel your pulse." "Oh no," replied I, "indeed I'm quite well." "Quite well. Can you eat biscuit and salt butter?" "Yes, I can." "And a piece of fat pork?" "Yes, that I can." "It's thanks to me then, Peter," replied he. "So you'll have no more of my medicine until you fall sick again." "I hope not," replied I, for it was not very pleasant. "Pleasant, you simple Simon! When did you ever hear of physic being pleasant, unless a man prescribed for himself? I suppose you'd be after lollipops for the yellow fever. Live and larn, boy, and thank heaven that you've found somebody who loves you well enough to baste you when it's good for your health." I held my tongue, and ate a very hearty breakfast. From that day I returned to my duty, and was put into the same watch with O'Brien, who spoke to the first lieutenant, and told him that he had taken me under his charge. Chapter 12.